By the fall of 1961, the Beatles were local stars in Liverpool and Hamburg. But playing the Cavern and the German clubs had become routine and a dead end. They seemed to have progressed as far as any group could, outside the musical mecca of London.
Since the scene was so controlled by the London moguls, who didn't want to know anybody from the provinces, people believed, and the Beatles believed, and all the Liverpool groups believed, that they enjoyed the music, they played the music, they'd make a few bob, and that was that.
And it was only, I think, when Brian Epstein actually came on the scene and was telling us how much money can be made, that we could actually make a record. Because none of us ever anticipated making records.
I hadn't had anything to do with pop management of pop artists before that day that I went down to the Cavern Club and heard the Beatles playing. And this was quite a new world, really, for me.
Brian Epstein wasn't much of a rock and roll fan. His own leanings were towards theatre and light classical music. But as manager of the record department in his father's furniture store, he followed pop music as a business necessity. Had there not been several requests for the Sheridan Beatles' My Bonnie, Brian never would have visited a place like the Cavern.
I was immediately struck by their music, their beat, and their sense of humour, actually, on stage. And even afterwards, when I met them, I was struck again by their personal charm. And it was there that really it all started.
Though he knew nothing about managing a group, Brian convinced the Beatles that he had the connections to make them famous.
His family had money and owned record shops. And the fact that he would have some pull in the music industry suddenly began to make people realise that he could maybe have some influence in getting them to become a national name.
Before Brian could get them their national name, he'd have to make a few changes.
When Brian took them over, he had plastic-type photographs, he had them all done in the suits. He really smoothed out their image. John would give me all photographs of them taken in Hamburg, pictures of him on stage with the toilet seat around his neck, or pictures of him reading the newspaper in his underpants in the Reaper barn. And as soon as Brian took them over, John came rushing round to me asking for all these pictures back because Brian wouldn't allow that sort of image with his boys.
In spite of Brian's efforts, the Beatles' horizon seemed hopelessly narrow. A third trip to Hamburg only darkened their somber mood. Stuart Sutcliffe had been suffering from severe headaches ever since the group had been jumped by a gang of toughs 2 years earlier in Liverpool. The day before they arrived, Stuart had died of a brain hemorrhage. Stunned by the death of Stuart and bored with playing the same old clubs, the Beatles needed some good news.
Brian Epstein walked into my office one day and said he got a group that he wanted me to hear. Brian had apparently taken one of his tapes into the EMI store in Oxford Street to get it transferred to disc. And the engineer heard it and thought it was very good. Brian told him how he'd been to every record company in the country and hadn't gotten anywhere with it. And he saw me because I had a reputation at that time for being rather screwball and rebellious, and I would take any nutty thing like the Beatles.
George Martin was as unlikely a producer for a rock and roll group as Brian Epstein was a manager. Although trained as a classical musician, he'd been producing eccentric comedy records at Parlophone, a specialty label owned by EMI. Ever on the alert for new ideas, Martin was intrigued by the demo Brian played.
The music wasn't frightfully original. There were no great songs there. It was just the sound was interesting. I arranged a recording test with them in Abbey Road, No. 3 studio, which meant I was going to spend a couple of hours with them finding out what they could do. They had a very, very funny version of Please Please Me, which was rather slow. They did have Love Me Do, weird things like Fat Swallows Your Feet's Too Big or Till There Was You. I got them to sing lots of different things to find out which voice was good. I was looking for the Cliff Richard or the Elvis Presley or the Tommy Steele, saying, now, is Paul going to be the main one or is John going to be the main one? And George, well, he's obviously not got such a good voice as the other two. And then it suddenly hit me right between the eyes. Why the hell should I find a solo singer? Why not just have the lot of them as they are? It wasn't their music that sold them to me. It was their charm. They were very charming people.
George Martin signed them and set a recording date. But there would be one more change before then.
Pete Best was probably the best looking of the bunch. He was very quiet with a sullen kind of charm.
Pete initially in Liverpool was the most popular member of the Beatles, particularly with the girl fans. And whenever the Beatles used to appear, all the girls used to shout and scream for Pete.
But he couldn't play drums very well. I mean, he couldn't keep in time too well. And I was aware that the band weren't tight. They needed that sort of binding force that a good drummer should give them. So I said to Brian, well, I'll get another drummer for the recording sessions. You can do what you like with him on stage, but we'll have someone else on the tracks. And I didn't realize until afterwards that they'd been thinking the same thing anyway.